Welcome to the Western Bell podcast series, with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of the series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled Languaging Nonduality. The talk was given by Rob Schmidt and Stuart Goodnick on September 7th, 2024 via Zoom. Rob and Stuart run Tayu Meditation Center and founded Many Rivers Books and Tea in Sebastopol, California. They invite spiritual teachers, practitioners, and authors to articulate their stories and engage in conversation about their work on the Mystical Positivist podcast. In this talk, they discuss the need for discernment in considering non-duality and their experience with teachers and practitioners who represent it as a description of reality. They note that language can point to the moon, to the continuity of the sacred, giving examples of this with poetry by Ursula Le Guin. They also say that the language of non-duality can be an intellectual proposition, an overlay on our actual experience. During this discussion, Rob and Stuart refer to historical figures, including the Indian master and non-dualist Nisargadatta Maharaj and the Zen master Dogen, to their own teacher, Robert Daniel Ennis, and to teachers they have encountered, including Lee Lozowick, who wrote the book Enlightened Duality, and Mr. E.J. Gold. They speak about aspects of the Gurdjieff work and conversations with a contemporary non-dualist, Rupert Spira. Participants in attendance make reference to Ma Devaki, who was the attendant of the Indian master Yogiram Sarat Kumar, to the Indian master Paparam Das, to Werner Erhard, who founded EST, and to a talk on non-duality by a student of non-dual teaching, Peter Cohen. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. Rob Schmidt speaks first, then Stuart Goodnick.
Running Many Rivers Spiritual Bookstore over the last 22 years, we've had many speakers, a cresting wave of non-duality, you might say, coming to the store. I'll just mention briefly that there's a Zendo in a nearby little village near Sebastopol that is hosting a talk, and someone brought a poster for the talk over to the store to put up in the window, which I was happy to do. And I asked him if he was a Zen student. He said, yeah, but really I'm a non-dualist. So that's another instigation for this talk. What does it mean to say that? What was he trying to convey by saying that? Some speakers over the years have been more or less skillful, I would say, in terms of the Buddhist term skillful means, to convey some aspect of what they thought they imagined or projected that word non-dual means and its relevance to practice. I just want to set that context. I'll further mention that one of my favorite books of Lee Lozowick's is Enlightened Duality, which I think is a wonderful response to a certain period in this history of the penetration of non-duality in our area. Literally a few miles from our house, some of the people who started the Science and Non-Duality Conference a number of years ago live and work. So we've been smelling non-duality quite a bit for many years now. And I'll leave it to you to decide what fragrance it might have for many of the people who've encountered it. Sometimes it doesn't appear to smell that good to them. And other times, as with the fellow that I just mentioned, he places his Zen practice within a context of non-duality, which is totally fine. But how that lands for other people, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I'll say a few things just in terms of the historic arc. From our vantage point of having a spiritual bookstore and having lots of people come through in the last 20 plus years, my observation has been that there was, as Rob said, a cresting wave some years ago where non-duality was the hottest thing. There were lots of spiritual teachers who would be non-dual. That's when the Science and Non-Duality Conference got started. And we would see lots of different people come through. Sometimes we would have speakers who were non-dualists. And, in later years, we met and done radio interviews with folks like Rupert Spira and Om C. Parkin, who identifies kind of as a non-dualist. And I've also noticed that some of the better examples of non-dual teachers have more of a basis or a concept of practice behind their non-duality, whereas in the early days, it was very much in vogue to eschew practice and say that this is it. All you need to do is have this kind of realization. And really, there was no practice because, as Krishnamurti said, truth is a pathless land and all that sort of stuff. And it always seemed problematic for us because we came of age in a tradition that was very focused on a very
grounded
practice in the world. It always seemed problematic to us because our framework of practice really did convey to us and gave us direct experience within ourselves of the pervasiveness of the mechanical mind and the identified mind. And so to hear someone blithely say that all you need to do is have this idea and have this realization and everything takes care of itself seemed to be a way of ignoring or putting off the confrontation with the mechanical nature of one's being. So non-dual teachers for whom there is actually some level of real practice integrated into their organizations and their paths strike us as more interesting. And fortunately, I think the days of the naive claims about non-duality have passed, and I think it's less of a thing now, which means that there's probably more serious practice that's happening in the existing non-dual communities. But what does that all mean? And this topic has got us thinking about how do you even use language to talk about these things? What is the use of language really about? Because our observation has been that language can be misapplied for talking about spiritual ideas and spiritual paths and practices, such that language is used to deflect away from or to make us look in a different direction than the direction we need to look at in order to really confront the reality of our natures. And we found that probably particularly the case with the assertions that non-duality was the ultimate teaching or the ultimate truth. And in some conversations, people nod knowingly, but none of those words really mean anything. I mean, what does it mean? What does it mean to say ultimate truth? What does it mean to say reality even? Use of language is interesting in spiritual practice because before one has direct experience of something, linguistic representations of it are really ineffective at providing any sort of transmission. So transmission happens in a different way. So we were thinking about, well, what does languaging non-duality even mean? And one concept that I'll lay out here that I've found useful for myself, and then I'll turn it back to Rob, is something that a friend of ours, a Tibetan teacher and translator, Ken MacLeod, has talked about and drew our attention to. And that's the distinction between results versus practice in spiritual discussions. He would observe when he would see Tibetan teachers often giving teachings that what they would be talking about were the results of practice. And yet, a lot of the Western audiences who were listening to them were listening as though what they were being told were practice methods. And I can give a more concrete example of this. There was a book that came out a number of years ago by Jacob Needleman called Lost Christianity. Very interesting book. And the thesis of it was that there was something missing from the manifestation of Christianity in the West that had been present in Christianity and had been lost or misplaced. And what was missing was the articulation of the practices necessary to attain to the results that are described. So, for instance, an admonition like love your neighbor like yourself sounds to a Western ear like this is a practice, but it's not. It's a result. You cannot, without having the experiential depth and preparatory practices, simply by active volition, love your neighbor as yourself. that is a consequence of a fairly deep and engaged practice. But when a Westerner hears that, what they do with that is to turn that into a rule or a practice. And that creates a kind of a dissociation, a spiritual dissociation, because psychologically, you're thinking you're trying to do something that really is not possible for your level of being. And when you try to do that and it doesn't work, then you can start to tell yourself stories that what you're doing is actually loving someone like yourself. And it creates a misunderstanding, a mild psychotic state that is something we find evident in a lot of the manifestations of Christianity today in American society. People are fervently telling themselves that they're doing what they're being told to do, but they really don't have the being capabilities of doing that, because there's a kind of practice that's necessary to cultivate that which ultimately then naturally manifests as a loving response to your neighbor. So that's what I mean by results versus practice. To me, that's a very clear example. And when you apply that then to the realizations of non-duality, the admonition to see the world as non-dual is a result, not a practice. And so that realization or that understanding or that sensibility arises out of something else, something deeper. When you just take that as an intellectual proposition and then try to apply it, the mind is very fervently trying to paste over one's experience with this conceptual gloss. And that is not realization. That's the mind trying to co-opt the spiritual process and create a story and a filter by which we can mediate our experience. Whereas non-duality seems to be pointing at a quality of experience that is not mediated by a conceptual layer.
So then what good is language? It is a way to express something useful about non-duality as a means to attain something interesting or connect with or realize something of utility. One of the tools that I've come to realize is that there are some poets who actually point at the moon, as Master Dogen would put it, to help us grasp what non-duality might actually look like from a distance, as it were. So I'm going to read a poem by my all-time favorite author, Ursula Le Guin, a wonderful author. Some of you may or may not have read some of this. So it's in various books, but I'm going to be reading from a book called Ursula Le Guin, Conversations on Writing with David Nyman. This book was put together just before her death in 2018. Nyman creates a little context before the poem. So I'm going to read that paragraph that she describes how the poem came about. She says, I was out in Harney County, which is Eastern Oregon. She lived in Portland most of her adult life. I was out in Harney County without a library, wondering what the word contemplation means. It seems to have the word temple in it, and the prefix con means together, you know. So that's where I started. And then, and this will explain the middle of the poem, there was a book in the ranch house, a kind of encyclopedia dictionary, and it had a very good essay on the word contemplation. So it was sort of a learning experience, this poem. So now I will read Contemplation at McCoy Creek. Seeking the sense within the word, I guessed, to be there in the sacred place, the temple, to witness fully and be thus the altar of the thing witnessed. In shade beside the creek, I contemplate how the great waters coming from the heights early this summer changed the watercourse. The 4 big midstream boulders stayed in place. The willows are some thriving and some dead, rooted in, uprooted by the flood. Over the valley in the radiant light, a raven takes its way from east to west. Shadow wings across the Rimrock Pass, as silent as the raven. Contemplation shows me nothing discontinuous. When I looked in the book, I found time is the temple, time itself and space, observed, marked out, to make the sacred place on the four-quartered sky the in-walled ground. To join in continuity, the mind follows the water, shadows the birds, observes the unmoved rock, the subtle flight. Slowly, in silence, without words, the altar of the place and hour is raised. Self is lost, a sacrifice to praise, and praise itself sinks into quietness. So it's not a very long poem, but my reading of it is quite rich. The key phrase might be seen as, in the middle of the poem, contemplation shows me nothing discontinuous. And it seems to me that that is a statement wholly congruent with a non-dual understanding of life, experience, reality, if you will. But there's more going on here. She contemplates how the great waters come from the heights. She contemplates how the willows are some thriving and dead. The raven takes its way from east to west and is followed by its shadow across the Rimrock Pass. And then the mind understands that this language does point to something. It points to the sacred and how the sacred emerges in our experience as a time and place where, joining in continuity, the mind can follow the continuous linkage of everything with everything else. It doesn't simply say, well, just sit out there and look at the raven flying overhead, and then you'll get it. You might get something, but this language points to a way in which our minds can be directed to point to the ability to follow the continuities that life is constantly displaying before us and within us, for that matter. So I think it reinforces the point that Stuart was just making about practice. We actually had a funny podcast conversation with Rupert Spira, who I like very much. He came into the store. He had a friend who lived in Sebastopol, so we got to see him a number of times. And we had our podcast conversation, and he was an advocate of getting people to drop their usual conceptual frame. And then we asked him whether that's the way he had come to his realization. Oh, no. He had a long set of practices that he had engaged in, but he did not reproduce those practices except after, he said, people had the initial opening to non-duality. I don't want to say that that doesn't work for some people, but I know it doesn't work for others. By observation, it wouldn't have worked for me because I tried something similar along the way. So I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say about some of these reflections that this poem leads my mind to follow. Any questions, comments, reactions?
I think the line that most moved me was the very end. I don't know if you can reread that line, but it was something about the silence.
Self is lost, a sacrifice to praise, and praise itself sinks into quietness.
That really gets me because we don't come to praise or quietness or silence usually without some type of work at it, practice at it. Many people will come to the retreat center and say, I couldn't bear myself after 3 days because my mind was so busy. But I think she's definitely one who has had a lifetime of contemplation. It's not just something she made up on the spot for her poem.
I'll agree with that. And the thing that struck me about the line you asked me to read again is the word praise. Because when I was growing up, I read the Bible. I was brought up in a Roman Catholic school. And that word praise occurs a lot. And I didn't understand what it meant. I never understood what it meant. It's actually been only in recent decades that I've really started to resonate with that word and find it to be something that takes me to a place, as the poem says, praise itself sinks into quietness. Because if words that are supposed to convey praise do not embody praise, then it's impossible, or at least it never worked for me, to get to that quiet place. But I also think that the temple contemplation is important, because the phrase just before that passage, the altar of the place and hour is raised. I think that's another way, another important direction to point to the moon, as Dogen would put it, and to leave behind the considerations that obscure that contemplation shows me nothing discontinuous. Everything is linked. I mean, that itself is, to me, a statement of non-duality in a way.
Buber has made a statement a number of times, lots of times actually, that just like everything in evolution matures, grows, develops into something that didn't used to be. He says that in spirituality, that applies as well, and that what used to be demanded of a spiritual aspirant in the forms of practice no longer necessarily apply unless you believe they do. And that just the principles of non-duality, as he articulates them, and he does have meditations on them, he leads meditations, which vividly point to the moon. But I was curious as how you felt about that statement of Rupert's, that the old forms of practice may not be necessary anymore. If you have the self-honesty and the earnestness, as Nisargadatta might say, those qualities, earnestness and self-honesty, if you have those, if those are in place, then a lot of forms that may have been necessary in the past are no longer necessary.
Well, first I'll just say my own view is that human beings are different and need to have different practices and experiences to support honesty and self-inquiry. I am hesitant to agree with, oh, this is old hat.
Yeah, I like Rupert Spira, so don't take this wrong, but I think that's just a shtick. He has a corpus of tantric practices behind the practices of being aware of awareness. He certainly creates spaces where there can be some transmission of energy of a sort, but all I can speak to is my own experience. I remember when I was 8 years old, I was precocious learning about science. I learned about astronomical system, and I was outside playing with some friends. And for some reason, I was thinking about, I understand the Earth, I understand the moon, I understand the solar system, I understand the galaxy. And then for some reason, my mind said, why do I experience I? And it was a shock. It was a complete shock. And that shock, I can say now, reverberated through the rest of my life. But I went back to just being a kid. So I did have this experience of something, like a confrontation with something of a different category of being that was completely outside of the operations of the mental processes. But I didn't have a stable framework within which that could persist or that could actually be cultivated in a direct sense. Now, you may argue, well, look at you now. Your life was oriented towards spiritual practice. So obviously, the seed took some time to bear fruit, and that may well be. But I also observed, and this is our fourth way sensibilities coming to the fore, that there is a lot of inertia in the mechanical or automatic functioning of the mind and the organism. And we don't take that for granted. There has to be some ongoing work with that and transformation of that in some form or another for the intuition or that depth of experience of that different category of being to take root and go from a spark of inspiration into something that informs all aspects of one's life. So maybe it's a matter of, again, language. For someone to have a experience of a teacher pointing to their awareness, I think the Tibetans call this pointing practices. And this is the sort of thing that Rupert will do in workshops with people. Sure, pointing to that category of being, which is outside of the operation of the mind and experiencing in a space, that's wonderful. But there are still these inertial patterns which will reassert themselves when the unusual circumstances of being in a workshop with Rupert Spira go away. And one may have the memory of that experience and maybe even some access to it, but it doesn't seem to me that that is sufficient for what I'd call a transformation at every level of one's being. And I don't know that anything has really changed. I don't think that we're in this new paradigm of spiritual practice. We are certainly in a new paradigm in the sense that we have access to vastly more lineages at the tips of our fingers, and we have access to communication to practitioners at a level that was never possible on the planet before. So in that sense, there are certain obstacles that for someone who has that earnestness would have been present in a different time and place. So in a different society, even if you were earnest, you might never have the occasion to run into someone who actually could provide you with some direction. Today, if you're earnest, there are a lot of possibilities. So in that sense, I think that's changed, but I don't think the process itself is any different, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And I'll just add that I'm skeptical. I'm not talking about Rupert here. He offers a sophisticated understanding of what he wants to point to. But I have also seen unsophisticated people and representing non-duality, the concept non-duality, as the ultimate description of reality. I just don't agree with, mostly because I see people who have done fantastic things with their lives who wouldn't know a non-dual button on their shirt. It's just crazy to me. It's like in ordinary exoteric religions, many such paths will make claims to be uniquely useful, uniquely perfect, the way to go. We all know this. And I'm just skeptical of language that wants to claim that in this additionally more sophisticated realm. You know, the Buddhists have emptiness, if you can have emptiness. And so that's their way to talk about it, a similar thing. And yet more sophisticated Buddhists, in my reading and hearing, don't make the claim that emptiness is the only thing that there is. So we need to be discerning, it seems to me, about how we talk about these things.
I was pretty sure I did not agree with the idea of non-duality because coming up through the Gurdjieff work, the emphasis is on unifying the self and creating the I am, which seemed at odds with a system that seemed to say there is no I, no self. After listening to Peter's last talk, I made up a joke because I love fun, and it went like this. Peter, as an avowed dualist, I challenge you to a duel. Put up your dukkha. Because dukkha is a Sanskrit word for suffering and pain. That was my joke. But in preparation for this talk tonight, I decided to actually look it up for once, and I did run right into Spira, who defined non-duality, saying non-duality is the recognition that underlying the multiplicity and diversity of experience, there is a single, infinite, and indivisible reality whose nature is pure consciousness, from which all objects and selves derive their apparently independent existence. And then I said, duh, I've always believed this. It's a no-brainer. I think it would be hard to argue against this from my point of view. And so it provides me a lot of good contradictory thought, because now I have to encapsulate the one within the other and the other within the other, that there is no I and there is. So it seems to me that non-duality is a very fine background on which we can hang our spiritual tradition, whatever it is, our practice, whatever it is.
Well, thank you. I will just throw in here that Robert Daniel Ennis, who founded our tradition, has something that I return to again and again and again. It's a little aphorism, if you will, or saying, I am that I am. Thou art that I am. One of the contemplations that has engendered in me is the truth that I am created by the entirety of the rest of the universe that I'm supposedly separate from in a dualist mode. On the other hand, it means something to me. It resonates in my body when I direct that form of attention to another being or body or experience even. So I like that you brought up this idea of contradiction, because I think it's in these contradictions and the confrontation with contradictions that we can emerge with contemplation shows me nothing discontinuous. It's all linked.
I also would add that certainly when I've tried to look at Gurdjieff's material and understand, is this dualistic or non-dual? Occasionally, depending on how you ask the question, you'll get different answers. But certainly that quote you read from Rupert Spira about non-duality maps pretty nicely onto how I understand the absolute in the Gurdjieff language to be represented. So that everything comes from the absolute. And Gurdjieff goes on to say that we all contain a particle of God in ourselves. So I guess I would language it differently. My understanding in the fourth way is the work is not so much to create an I am, but to dissolve or to digest the false eyes or the false identification of self, such that that thing which is within us and always has been within us becomes, to use Gurdjieff language, an active factor in our common presence rather than a passive factor. And the normal state of being for us is that the false personality or the egoic structure is the active factor. And consequently, the passive factor is that essential part of ourselves that is the subject, but isn't really the inspiration of our actions in the ordinary hypnotic state that people find themselves in. And I'll also say that I'm not absolutist about the fourth way language, even though it's a great metaphor to say that people are asleep. I find that problematic just because it's misused. Everyone wakes up every now and then in some point in their lives. The question is whether there's something to catch and sustain and to cultivate and to promote those moments such that they're not fleeting, but they have some support so that they can deepen and grow within us. To me, the fourth way, Gurdjieff's work has behind it what I would call a non-dual sensibility in one sense, but a lot of the focus is on the problem at hand. And the problem at hand is us in our dualistic manifestation, basically living our lives in bodies. And what do you do about that?
Early in my searching, I experimented with every imaginable teaching and substance along the way. And the one thing that became clear at a certain point was that there was so much complication. I talk about complication because I find the Gurdjieff work to be extremely complicated. And when I ran into teachers who were more non-dual, I felt such a relief because here was simplicity. It seemed to me that what truth was, if it could be anything, it had to be simple. If it was complicated, then yes, it could be useful. I suppose it was useful to me along the way, but at a certain point, I craved simplicity. So when I hit upon the simplicity of that way of approaching truth, it was so refreshing and actually triggered an awakening in me. Something happened when I hit the simplicity of what I'm calling non-duality. And one of the problems with languaging non-duality is that what's absolute or what's the no self does not discount the personality, the self. that self is also part of the whole. It is not even part of it. It is the whole. Everything is the whole. It's not separate from this emptiness, like the Buddhist expression of form as emptiness. That's just true. But what's often thought of as non-dual, the reason why non-duality is often misunderstood is because people think, at least by my observation, that it means something very outside of what we call manifest expression. It's not. Non-duality is that too. And that's one of the many ways it gets tricky to language it.
Yeah, I think it is tricky to language it because the minute you say non-dual, you committed a dualistic act because you've created an opposition. By its very nature, it's problematic. Another aspect, and this will be another toss out there for the fourth way people, is in the fourth way, much is made of the three forces. Referred to as the active, the passive, and the harmonizing, or the affirming to the denying and the reconciling. And in a way, just like we have capacities in the brain structures that pull things together and separate things out, and those get brought together to create this totality of our awareness. One way of seeing duality and non-duality is that they're aspects of a greater mystery that's beyond both of those. In that sense, manifestation is this interplay of dual and non-dual forces that are interacting, but the mystery is the inspiration that's behind that. And so as a fourth way person, I'd say the third force is the mystery that's beyond that, beyond even non-duality. And that's maybe a linguistic way to transform myself out of the problem of the duality of non-duality. But it's another way of looking at that there's truth to being non-dual and there's truth to being dual. And there's an individuality, an aspect of individuality, and yet there's a connection to a totality. Those are phases of a greater mystery. And I don't know if I have much to say about that greater mystery because it's something that I think we can open ourselves to, but like the poem that Rob read, to speak of it is to ultimately descend into the quiet.
But only after we access the temple. We raise the temple, according to the poem, at least. We raise the temple at the hour and in the place that is the temple, in ourselves. And that's what then leads onward. We can all be grateful because ways to use language. Put your attention on something bigger than that small self that we get so fixated on. So, fantastic.
So the language of non-duality is itself pointing at the moon, right?
Of course it is. But if we instantiate it as a thing in itself, that language, we're running into the danger that we will put expectations on other people that language will have the same effect on them. And it may well do the exact opposite of what we would wish and intend to offer. So it's tricky. I do love that Enlightened Duality book of Lee's. That talks in his later years. He would so skillfully weave different things into one conversation and end with a bouquet where all the parts are visible. I had such deep respect for that capacity. But I think that's also what this discussion calls us to appreciate in ourselves, the capacity in ourselves to hold all these many things in one heart, in one set of hands. Inspiration is a wonderful thing. We get inspiration in our particular, in some ways, narrow individualities that serve as gateways to that which is bigger. Thou art that I am.
You've been talking a lot about language. You started off with a question about the value of language. To me, the value is resonance. To me, language has the potential to invoke, and there can be a resonance with that. So for me, most non-dual language, I have no resonance with. It just leaves me cold. But on the other hand, I really resonate with, say, the language of Werner Erhard, who I think is a sublime non-dual teaching. And yet he never talks about non-duality at all. But at the core of that teaching, to me, is non-duality. It's a very interesting thing because I really resonate with that, yet he never talks about non-duality. And there's lots of other teachers who I resonate with, some I don't. But the whole thing for me is the value I get from any kind of teaching is the resonance. And I think for me, the resonance comes from where the writer comes from or the speaker is coming from. So someone can be talking about non-duality or writing about lover and beloved, but if that's not where they're coming from, it's going to leave me cold. There'll be no resonance with it. So to me, language is very important. It has great value in communicating to other human beings.
What do you think of the idea, which has been suggested to be by many, that it's not the words, but it's the carrier wave that holds and carries the words?
Yeah, I think that's what I'm talking about when I say it matters where the speaker is coming from when they create that carrier wave.
Yeah, I was reflecting on a couple examples that come up in the non-duality space for me. Some non-duality language resonates with me, some does not. As much as I like Rupert Spira, I find his books hard to read. And there, I don't think it's a case of where he's coming from. It's a case of a more complex combination of my hearing, my antenna for receiving that particular wave. But another kind of interesting example I've observed in the non-dual space is that if I read Nisargadatta Maharaj's I Am That, and a translator is Morris Friedman, or someone correct me on that, but to me, that book is electric, and it's very direct, and it's a very direct transmission. If I read other translators of Nisargadatta Maharaj,
It's dead.
It's dead. It's completely flat. And the translator, from what I understand of I Am That, was a fairly deep practitioner. So there's the translation, there's the original words, and then there's this book, and then there's my ability to receive it. And it's this very complex equation. I have to still be tuned to be able to receive a certain thing. And I might receive it more reading Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson than reading Rupert Spira's. But it's a complex, many-fold phenomenon as how a transmission uses language to get from one place to the other. And as Rob said, there's this carrier wave behind it as well that's kind of ineffable. We're talking about ways in which language can suggest something beyond itself. The poem that Rob read was certainly a case. Inspirational speaking or certain kinds of languaging of spiritual thought in general that points to something beyond the language. But there's a form of language which is more direct and practical, which is simply the injunctions or the descriptions of practices, which is like a methodology. So you can use language to describe, in the fourth way case, the practice of self-observation. Now, you typically, with a practice, need to have a guide who's familiar with the exercise to actually make sense of what the instructions are. But the instructions, in one sense, can be something of a guide. And they're not trying to do anything other than invite you to move your attention in a particular way and then see what happens, and then to continue with that process. And so there the language is serving as a very practical guide to invite us to practice and leave it to us to experience what we experience. And presumably, if there's some objective thing that's being pointed to, that we will gain access to it through the deepening of our experience with the practice. So to me, that's an important element of language. And that gets to this difference I was talking about earlier about results versus practices. Descriptions of results, particularly when they're poetic, I think, serve to inspire us, and they feed us in a certain way. They tend to feed us at an emotional level so that we have the inspiration to continue to work. Descriptions of practices, although they may be drier, actually give us tools that we can apply and ultimately cultivate within ourselves the capacities to more directly appreciate that which the poetic descriptions have been pointing to. So I wanted to throw that out as another aspect of this whole languaging question. I was thinking about that with languaging of non-duality.
We just had a visit from Devaki Ma, who was Surat Kumar's attendant for so many years. And her whole practice is the nama, the repetition of the name of God. So I'm thinking of language also as the sounds, the Sanskrit, the repetition, the invocation of prayer out loud, the way in which it vibrates the body. Papa Ram Dass said that the saying of Om Shri Ram is actually a vibrational experience that awakens divinity within you.
Well, I'll take it back to the word praise that we were discussing before. My inclination is to say that that is an invocation of praise, and that, as the poem says, that praise can mature into something that in the poem is described as quietness, which is one way to point to when we get out of our own way, in the sense that we're no longer creating obstacles to seeing that nothing is discontinuous. But I fully agree with the idea that our bodies are instruments and that we can use our instruments in different ways. I mean, once again, to go back to the point I was making, it's like some people can use the body as an instrument in one way very effectively, and others, it just will not work, at least in the way that we would wish to see it work. But others can use a different practice that affects the body, that treats the body as an instrument. And the various forms of moving the body in the temple, for example, are ways that we can tune into or resonate with the energies that can be present when we invoke the temple at the right time and in the right place. So I appreciate your pointing that out, because our teacher's teacher, E.J. Gold, has a book entitled The Human Biological Machine as a Transformational Apparatus, which sounds so damn clinical. He's saying something interesting and useful in that book, but for some people, that clinical approach will work, and for others, it won't. So all praise to all ways.
I would add something about the use of sound and the use of resonance and vocalizations. I look at that as taking our human biological machine as an antenna, and we can, through practices, tune ourselves to qualities, rasas, energies. Lately, I've been looking at material, reading and doing some practices that derive from the Hermetic canon of Kabbalism. The practices there, in a way, are not unlike what you were describing. They're different, but in the letter magic, there's a threefold concentration where one imagines a color, one hears a sound, and one feels a sensation in the body. And each letter in the alphabet basically represents a different quality of energy, some of which are very divine and some of them are more human-oriented. But someone who's engaged in this practice seriously may spend years and years and years basically tuning themselves to each of these different letters in order to invoke particular qualities. And in a way, it's like when we tune to the divine, we can invoke the divine, the repetition of the name, absolutely. I think of these things mathematically where you can have lots of different coordinate systems for the same space. So I'm less committed to a particular language like Sanskrit or Tibetan or something as being privileged over another language. And even in the Kabbalistic system, the particular set of letters that might be used in one practice are different than in a different practice, which were probably different from Egyptian magic, where some of this stuff probably came from. But the important thing is what one does and what one is really trying to invite in and turn one's attention to and tune into on a ongoing basis, with a commitment of practice that returns you to that place and returns you to that place. And at least the way that the Kabbalistic system is described, initially when you engage in these practices, you have some sort of mental association and you're doing this work, but eventually the claim is that the actual energy, the universal energy that's being tuned into comes and you establish a relationship with that. And that feels right to me. It's certainly consistent with my experience of these sorts of things. We have a lot of possibilities. And what I love about this modern age is that we're exposed to a lot of these different possibilities. As Rob said, there's lots of different ways to enjoy and have a relationship with God. And a lot of it feels to me, like you were saying, as we're tuning ourselves, we're tuning our antenna so that we can receive and be as effective a receiver as possible.
One thing that we haven't spoken about very much is the role of a teacher, which is so out of vogue in some ways in the West, it seems to me. So here is a really inviting teaching. And to me, it's really easy to follow the raven and rest in peace when I'm sitting by the river. And my experience has been that when a teacher, and I don't mean a guide, a guru or a teacher gets involved, well, they stir the pot. That's part of their role, at least. And not all teachers or gurus have done it that way, but a lot have. Or when there's a big shock in one's life, I found that I can be shaken in a way that I had not imagined before. It seems like we can only do this by ourselves. I mean, really. But also, I don't think we can do it by ourselves. It's a paradox. I mean, there's a lot of paradox on the path.
Yeah. God knows I would have gotten nowhere. I would not have considered myself to have been invited into spiritual work until I met my teacher. That's for sure. I don't think I'm alone in that.
That's not really discussed so much in non-dual circles, it seems like to me. The kind of intensification that comes with a true realizer who is there to work with you.
Yeah, since I haven't studied with a non-dual teacher, I've had plenty of conversations with various people. This was a point in our podcast conversation with Mr. Spira that we were trying to hone in on. And I think we ended up disagreeing.
He was having none of
it. but that's okay, because everyone and everything is unique and connected to everything else. That's okay. For me, for many people, not unlike me, there's a necessary internal, I don't like the word shaking, but something has to be dislodged from its static position, probably surrounding the heart. As you say, I had to open that, but man, it was helpful to have someone who is very skillful at breaking the stasis in areas of my being that I was not familiar with.
I think that for a lot of people, a lot of us, we are blind to the stasis, don't even know it exists.
Right, exactly. Or I guess in my own case, I knew that there was something wrong, but I didn't know what it was. And I had no idea about what to do until I met someone who, I mean, my very first meeting, I was vibrating inside.
Not only do we not know what to do, but most of our society has answers that are in a very different direction. And so we absolutely have a signal to noise issue, to use an engineering metaphor here.
Talk about coordinate systems again.
That was, I have to be true to my conditioning. So, yeah, how do you find out? I go back and forth on this myself, because on the one hand, earnestness is important. If you have earnestness, then nothing can stop you. I think in the Gurdjieff circles, they say it takes gold to make gold. There's a lot of language like that that suggests that there's a sort of minimum commitment or minimum inspiration that one has, and then one can find one's way. But if I look at myself, I certainly see lots of habits of inertia, and I see ways in which I needed help, like Rob said. It's not so vogue to say that. In fact, some communities say that the age of the teacher is gone, it's past. I don't buy that. The teaching models may not be quite as electric, dramatic, and intense as they may have been in past times, but I still think there has to be some pressure that's being applied.
You said just now something along the lines, if you have some minimum level of commitment, or you have some kind of commitment, that you'll find your way. But I know a lot of people, I've met lots of people over the years, less so now because I've lived on an ashram for several years and have been put in touch with people that I would say are less confused about their practice because they're mostly informed by a lineage and mostly informed by some kind of teacher or guru, somebody that they can be accountable to. But I've met lots of people who seem to have a really genuine commitment, and they're just lost and confused, looking at it from hindsight. And at the time, I would also say that I was lost and confused. If I was really being self-honest, I thought I was enlightened, probably. I thought I had it all figured out already. This is kind of the crux of the needing a teacher situation, because I was I was a fool amongst fools. And then only once I had actually recognized, through having it pointed out to me, mostly subtly, that I was confused, did I finally realize I'm confused.
Well, that's interesting. In the fourth way, we have toasts to the idiots. There are all these different kinds of idiots, of course. That's an invocation or evocation of how we fool ourselves. But the point that's coming up to me, or came up to me even before you started talking, is we haven't mentioned Sangha. And at one point, I was participating in something called the Sutra Salon. And so we were reading all the Pali Canon and Mahayana Canon sutras. And I would say that, in my recollection at least, the most commonly repeated phrase in the Pali Canon is, you need to hang out with people who share your intention. That it's really, really helpful. And in Buddhism, there's the three-legged stool, and the teacher and the Dharma and the Sangha are critical. I ended up having a very close relationship with my teacher, but if I didn't, I would have needed more input from Sangha to destabilize the static wall around my heart. That had to happen. I don't know if that's relevant to your situation, but I dare say in the ashram, you probably get some feedback.
I want to add one point to this consideration. It is interesting. I look at this through lots of different lenses. Yes, absolutely, a certain kind of earnestness is necessary. There was something in your own experience that was distinguished from some of the people that you know who were confused and remain confused about their relationship to their spiritual intuitions. And something was different for you. Maybe you could hear something, maybe someone said something in the right way, and you continued to build on that. I don't know if it's a case where many are called and few answer. That's the old adage about this problem. But another thing I guess I find important is, for myself, my spiritual work, my spiritual quest is something about me, and I'm happy to share it. But I think there's value in lives, whether people are formally doing spiritual practice or not. And there's value in people being confused for a period of time. And for me, I want to be clear in my relationship with people who are not formally in a spiritual practice that that's okay, that their life is meaningful to their being. And their being may have completely different purposes than my being has in this particular manifestation. Whereas maybe at one time, particularly when I was a spiritual student starting out in a formal practice, you get very evangelical at that stage in one's practice, and you think everybody should be doing this. My sense now is that there's not a problem. I mean, yes, there's problems in the world that we see with people acting from pain and suffering. And yes, there's lots of different things that can be done to alleviate that suffering. But I don't think everyone needs to be doing formal spiritual practice. It's something that's available, and it's something that I certainly find profound and the most important thing in my life. But I work at an ordinary job, and I deal with people, and I have to deal with them from the place in my heart that their lives are as valid as my life.